I'm Samer Choucair. I head CE Creates, which is a venture building platform at Crescent Enterprises. We use this platform to conceive, build, and operate startups in the sustainability space. These are businesses that we ourselves are conceiving and take all the way from idea to operation. So corporate governance, to me at least, is a set of policies, rules, and regulations to actually allow a company to operate smoothly while eliminating any potential conflict of interest issues, any potential legal issues, delegating a needed amount of authority to various different levels of functions and people within an organization. In general, for a startup, the last thing they think about is corporate governance. It's typically a company is started by a founder, and all they worry about on a day-to-day basis is how they're going to survive to the next day and how to build the business. The last thing they're concerned about is corporate governance and how to run the company in a way that's very structured and organized. And even in some cases, they actually see it as an obstacle. It's just something that takes more time than they have to spare at that point of the life cycle of a business. But I look at it in a different way. Typically, that mentality that I just mentioned of a founder kind of decision maker for a business is how most startups are founded or are operated. And the successful ones that get to the point where they're large enough and they've made it to several hundred employees and they become well-established businesses. At that point, they're still being run in that same way as a founder decision maker, which can cause issues when you're at that size, because everything comes down to this single decision maker. Now, at that point, to change and to actually restructure and to reorganize the business into a properly governed organization becomes very, very difficult. We know that change management in general for business is a tough activity. So our theory is that building corporate governance from the get-go, building it into the culture of the business, makes it a lot more effective in the long run. And so we do that with all our startups, basically. Well, I mean, again, we look at the organizational structure, we look at the board structure, we look at delegations of authority, we look at checks and balances when it comes to financials. There's several requirements that need to be in place for corporate governance to be applied in an effective manner. There's several things I mentioned, including legal setup and legal structure of the business, shareholder structure, voting power, and so on. How is funding associated with good governance? Well, any institutional investors will want to ensure that proper corporate governance is in place. So that's another point where startups usually find themselves kind of stuck, is when they've grown and they get to a point where they need to raise money, and then they realize that investors are coming to them and saying, look, you don't have proper corporate governance in place. Your structure isn't rugged or rigid enough for us to be comfortable investing, because you don't have proper checks and balances, right? So I think it's extremely important. Proper corporate governance structures are extremely important to be able to attract institutional money for startups. First of all, having a board and an advisory board, having multiple signatory authorities, for example, having a proper uh, finance organization that is somewhat independent from the rest of the operation, um, and having a robust shareholder agreement and shareholder structure in place.